joining me on the papers on Canal the English broadcast from Douala, Cameroon. My name is Gladys Ambodibang. This morning we begin with the Median newspaper that sees as the Biya celebrates 35 years in power, he is silencing his detractors, and according to the Median newspaper, Philemon Yang has become Cameroon's longest-serving prime minister. It writes that the 70-year-old discreet self-efficacy and taciturn son of Ginika Jem in Oku in the Bui division in northwest Cameroon, who was appointed to the Star Building on June 30th, 2009, has finally broken the record. Broken the record until now has finally broken the record, being the longest serving prime minister in Cameroon, and that until now was held by the Honorable Peter Mafani Musonge, whom the paper described as the father of the Fako political emancipation. The paper tells us that Mafani served as prime minister for 8 years, 2 months and 3 weeks, that is from September 19, 1996 to the December 8, 2004, but that Yang has already made 8 years, 4 months and is counting. Page 5 of today's edition of the Median Post newspaper has details on that story. And again, the paper informs us that Agbobala has fired back at southern Cameroon's detractors and says they are living in a dream world and that he will defeat Siseko Julius in election and be the president if ever the Amazonian in quote dream comes to reality. If you read page 2 of today's edition of the Median newspaper, you equally read other remarks contained in Bala's recent audio recording. And then in Boya, in the southwest region of Cameroon, the Median Post newspaper tells us that the mayor there is lamenting Carlos' indifference of the southwest elites over attack on his home and says the elites are a band of inhumane and self-seeking ingrates who cannot be counted on. And equally in this edition of the Median Post newspaper, you equally read how Mark Barretta turns the fourth conclave of Skakuf Governing Council into a boxing ring after he charged the leaders of greed, corruption and bad faith. According to the paper, the incident took place at Skakuf meeting in neighboring Nigeria. The Secretary General of the Governing Council is reported by the paper to have resigned in Katimini. You have the details of all these news articles in today's edition of the Median newspaper. And then we move to another newspaper this morning, that is a Frago Daily, which tells us about disgraced Agbobala CPDM membership exposed as his pride, ego and reputation has gone down the drain. It says Akeremuna got Agbobala into this dangerous game of 1 billion francs CFA bribery scheme, and that the Munas were the power brokers between Bala's government to call for school resumption and lawyer back to court. January 8 is set by the paper to be school resumption date in the southern Cameroon area, and that's Amazonian new government takes new shape. You have all that in this edition of Frago Daily, which again tells us about the fourth conclave resolutions. It says the people of southern Cameroon, which it puts Amazonian in quotes, fully support conclave resolution by 100%, and that all SCAFCO frontline leaders have promised to support the new interim government. If you want the details on that story, then you need to read today's edition of the Frago Daily newspaper. And then we'll go to the Horizon newspaper this morning that tells us about the Anglophone crisis and talks about ELAT that speaks out. It says that the exclusive interview that the chairman of AACI and AAC2 of 1993 and 1994 advises Anglophone to speak with one voice, and that SCNC chairman has also urged Anglophones to keep mounting pressure on the head of state Paul Biya and be prepared for a long-time resolution to their problem. It says that the AAC3 will be timely to tell the Biya regime that if it doesn't act as they were saying in the 1990s, then the zero option would fit in. He says he is still ready to support the Anglophone struggle. We have the details on that story in this edition of the Horizon newspaper, which is equally interested in government projects and says that it launches a sustainable development plan for the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. Have the details in this edition of the Horizon newspaper. Then we move over to the Voice newspaper, which is interested in whom in the Menchum division in northwest Cameroon, and tells us about Menchum that celebrates the General Aga's appointment promotion. It says Menchum still awaits his first ever minister in Bia's 35-year rule. If you want the details on that, then you read the Voice newspaper published this morning. And then we move over to the Sun, or to the Sun newspaper, which says talks about the Anglophone crisis and top United States senators that express worry over Cameroon. It says it supports a unified Cameroon based on equality. You have that on page 3 of today's edition of the Sun newspaper, which equally tells us about the stalemate in Limbe, Paramount chieftaincy talks, and says Mulanjo Litumbe throws Pana in the works. It equally tells us about Limbe that strengthened ties with the city of Ngaoundéré. You have all that in this edition of the Sun newspaper. And then it tells us again that the outlaw consortium disowns barrister Agbo Bala. You have that in this edition of the Sun newspaper, which says the consortium, Agbo Bala says the consortium is illegal as of January 17, 2017. The details are found in this edition of the Sun newspaper, which again tells us about Bia 35 years on and says it is an anniversary unlike others. If you want the details, then you read today's edition of the Sun newspaper. Let's move over to the Star newspaper this morning. The Star, which is interested in internet shutdown in the northwest and southwest region, and says it persists if the users accuse Minister of Post and Telecommunication of falsely blaming mobile telephone operators, whereas the government is trouble peddling with the internet cuts, and says so far only landlines and direct lines are operational and reduced bandwidth in the southwest and northwest regions, as investigations have revealed. Have the details on page 6 of today's edition of the Star newspaper. And then we have the Anglophone crisis, which equally makes news in today's edition of the Star newspaper. It says he asks the question: has Prime Minister Yang abandoned the southwest region? And tells us that Yang must tour the 13 divisions that make up the southwest region and the northwest region as well, to show he is prime minister for all and not prime minister only for the northwest region of Cameroon. And then we move to Ekiliwindi in the southwest region. It is situated just a few kilometers away from Kumba in the Meme division in southwest Cameroon. It tells us that Ekiliwindi has privatized fleeing brigade commander's farms and his piggery. If you want the details on that, then you read today's edition of the Star newspaper. And then the Star newspaper tells us about a startling revelation and says Pope Francis has requested Roman Catholic priests to be given the right to get married. You have that in this edition, and how Buhari warned arrest of Jonathan, who plunged Nigeria into a war. You have all that in this edition of the Star newspaper. Then let's move over to the Guardian Post this morning. The Guardian Post captions on Agbo Bala and tells us that he mocks the decision sacking him from the consortium. According to the paper this morning, the president of the Outlaw Cameroon Anglophone Civil Society Consortium, that is Barrister Nkongo Felix Agbo Bala, has made nonsense of a recent decision dismissing him as member of the proscribed body. In a brief telephone chat the Guardian Post newspaper had with Agbo Bala yesterday, he says he returned from a foreign trip recently. The paper says he laughed over the decision by some 8 Anglophone activists banning him as the member of the consortium, while describing the decision as inconsequential given that the consortium is no longer a legal body. Agbo Bala said he is not budgeted by the action, or is not balked by the action, before later opting not to further comment on the issue. If you want details on that, you read page 3 of the Guardian Post newspaper. And then the paper again takes us to October 1, the incident that occurred on that day, and says 10 out of the 200 arrested in Manfe in the Manyo division have been granted bail. Reports says that, or reliable sources says that over 200 others who were also arrested and detained during the purported independence declaration that was last October 1 are still being held behind bars and obviously acting on instructions from higher quarters. The presiding magistrate Lucy Ngwanye Nka set the rather hard bail conditions at 700,000 francs CFA per detainee. If you want the details on that story, then you need to read today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper, which equally tells us about Biya's 35 years in power that is being celebrated today, and asks the question if it is a blessing or a curse for the Anglophones. Have that on page 5 of the Guardian Post newspaper. And then we move over to the Post newspaper, which captions on Biya's 35th anniversary. It says the reign of an imperial president, and talks of 35 years of sloganeering and failed promises, the religious, the political strongman, and Cameroon's one-party system or multi-party system. You have that in this edition of the Post newspaper. Then let's move over to the Eden newspaper, which talks about precarious situation of Anglophone refugees in neighboring Nigeria, and says that the Director General of the Nigerian Cross River State Emergency Management Agency, John Inaku, has said they cannot give any exact figures because once you register 2,000, you only realize that many more come in the next day, and says they have many other challenges such as open defecation, or their water sources have been tampered with, and that they need more pit toilets. You have that on page 5 of today's edition of the Eden newspaper. And then the Eden newspaper says the CPDM is in a big feast as Biya clocks 35 years in power. And according to Solomon Tembeng of the Eden newspaper, militants of the Cameroon's People Democratic Movement, the CPDM, over the national territory have rolled out drums and gilded their loins for big feast marking the 35th anniversary of President Paul Biya's ascension to power, and says over the weekend preparations for the feast were at full throttle within the various sections of the party. The event will feature sports and cultural activities as well as political rallies. You have that on page 3 of the Eden newspaper. And then as the CPDM celebrates Biya's 35 years in power, Prime Minister Philemon Yang has cautioned CPDM militants to avoid confrontations during the celebrations. You read that in this edition of the Eden newspaper, which equally asks the question, has Prime Minister Philemon Yang sealed Fonteche's grip on Nuwefu? You have that on page 3, and how the Southwest and Northwest rank middle position in anti-corruption drive in the country. Page 2 of the Eden newspaper has the details on that story. This article brings us to the end of today's edition of the papers on Canal de English. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to our programs.